Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that burns Hollywood's toys in front of its eyes in an attempt to make sure that it grows up properly like the responsible parents we are. I'll be your detective this evening, and today we're going to be looking at Christopher Nolan's 2006 effort, The Prestige.
Are you watching closely?
But first, let's go over the case notes. The Prestige is a 1995 epistolary novel written by Christopher Priest, detailing the escalating rivalry at the end of the 19th century between two magicians, Rupert Angier and Alfred Borden, by way of their diary entries mashing together two different perspectives which tell stories about their own pasts into one book. The novel was exceptionally well received and was nominated for several prominent genre fiction awards, including the Bram Stoker Award and the Arthur C. Clarke Award, although it did end up winning a World Fantasy Award in 1996. Producer Valerie Dean had read the novel and actively sought after Priest for the rights to an adaptation. The Prestige was then brought to the attention of Christopher Nolan around the year 2000, whilst Nolan was still doing press for Memento and began reading it during. Intrigued by the narrative richness of a movie about two magicians, he pitched the idea to his brother Jonathan, and furthermore asked Aaron Ryder of Newmarket Films to option the rights to Priest's novel. Christopher Priest himself had been impressed with Nolan's previous works following a Memento and allowed the rights to be sold to Newmarket. Around the same time the rights got sold, Christopher Nolan began working on Insomnia's production and asked Jonathan Nolan to help collaborate on the script. The writing process was long, ultimately lasting around 5 years, during which time Nolan was able to prep and shoot both Insomnia and Batman Begins, attributing the lengthy gestation on finding ways to visually depict the novel's literary devices, as well as reframing the narrative from epistolary to the standard 3-act structure for filmmaking, the overall quality of which Christopher Priest enthusiastically approved of. When Batman Begins began pre-production in 2003, the project began to slow down, only for it to restart around the same time Begins was released, and when the movie became a money-making smash, Warner Brothers became interested in picking up the distribution rights and came on board swiftly afterwards as producers. The project officially began shooting on January 16, 2006, with production designer Nathan Crowley taking the schedule across locations such as the Broadway district of Los Angeles and redressed sections of the Universal backlot to create an authentic period setting for the movie, which eventually finished post-production on September 22nd to meet an official release on October 17th. So Christopher Nolan had a golden opportunity after Batman Begins to basically make whatever the hell he wanted to make, and he ultimately decided to complete a long-standing project about, of all things, two rivaling magicians. Why exactly? Well, let's investigate, shall we? Once again, our story is being told in a non-linear fashion, or rather there's the main story which takes place in the past, which is framed through diary entries from the two protagonists. Alfred Borden, played by Christian Bale, whom in the relative present is awaiting the gallows, reads from Angier's diary, played by Hugh Jackman, which journals Angier's thoughts as he tries to decode Borden's diary, and both diaries tell the main plot together from two different perspectives which the narrative presents simultaneously. I am already not at all fucking surprised that the script took so long to write. So anyway, the main plot concerns Angier and Borden as a pair of magician's assistants who eventually become bitter rivals after Borden inadvertently kills Angier's wife during a botched water tank escape. They both then set off to become magicians of their own, Angier backed by Michael Caine's John Cutter, an engineer, aka a man who designs illusions, and Borden performing completely on his own with only his wife, played by Rebecca Hall, as moral support. The rivalry then takes a different form as both of them become established magicians, competing for the same audience in theatre act after theatre act in a bid to outperform the other, as well as stealing each other's tricks and reworking them to prove who of the two can perform the greatest magic trick of all time. Depending on whether or not you count Insomnia, The Prestige marks Christopher Nolan's second big Hollywood production, and after Batman Begins, you get the sense that Nolan has learned a few don'ts lessons. For starters, his style changed between films. Nolan used to be very much a lock it off on a tripod sort of guy, but between this and Batman Begins, Nolan takes a move into handheld. This was purportedly because after working with his usual style on a large production such as Batman Begins, Nolan got sick and tired of telling Gary Oldman day in day out to stand on a marker so the camera can move properly. With handheld, you're able to stage sequences and set shots for the actors and not the other way around. Admittedly, this is at the sacrifice of tight camera work, but Nolan has never really been a great visual storyteller anyway, as half of the legwork with Nolan is in the editing room afterwards. And that's fine, all directors work differently, just as long as you get the job done. With handheld also comes looser cinematography, but Wally Pfister manages to find ways to light and design shots around it. There's more than a few sequences in here that feel magnificent, and coupled with Nathan Crowley's beautifully lavished and washed-in production design, you've got yourself a pretty decent-looking and elegantly fleshed-out universe for the story to take place in. But the camera work department and special effects are ultimately the sprinklings of cinnamon on top of the delicious three-tiered raspberry trifle that is this movie. We're here to get our story on. So the first question is indeed the question I asked earlier. Why is it that Christopher Nolan decided to make a movie about magicians? Well, let's explore what magicians do in a philosophical sense. Technically, what a magician does is make the impossible seem temporarily possible by way of staging elaborately and intricately designed stage illusions, whether that be presented in the form of, say, a deck of cards or a large box. But the philosophical question is one not often asked. Christopher Priest's novel expresses a magician's trade thusly. The prestidigitator and the audience have entered into what I term the pact of acquiescent sorcery. They do not articulate it as such, and indeed the audience is barely aware that such a pact might exist, but that is what it is. The performer is, of course, not a sorcerer at all, but an actor who plays the part of a sorcerer and who wishes the audience audience to believe, if only temporarily, that he is in contact with darker powers. The audience, meantime, knows that what they are seeing is not true sorcery, but they suppress the knowledge and acquiescence to the self-same wish of the performers. What Priest is more or less referring to there is the common artistic idea of suspending one's disbelief, a very powerful and important tool when it comes to creating anything that can be considered narrative. So if narrative is what we're talking about here, and a magician is the facilitator thereof, then it would be easy to extend this thought towards filmmaking itself. The director, in this context, is the magician of their own movies. They are the orchestrators of what occurs as well as the manipulator of ideas and visuals to help the audience lull themselves into a shared delusion that reality is what takes place within the flickered lights on the wall. An audience watching a magic trick knows that the magician does not really possess arcane powers, but go along with it because those are the rules of this kind of entertainment.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
Likewise, we know that Russell Crowe is not really a Roman general, that he's not really fighting these men that he seems to fight, that the blood is just stage makeup, but in our heads we play along with the game. We choose to forget that we recognise this man and allow ourselves to follow along with the story presented to us. With The Prestige, Christopher Nolan is essentially trying to use the template of a magician's act to make an analogous comparison to filmmaking itself. If filmmaking is, as Mark Cousins described it, a lie to tell the truth, then filmmaking is one of the grandest lies of all, asking a roomful of people to believe that what you are seeing is not a group of actors in costumes on a set paid for by a big company. But make note of that second half, to tell the truth. If you watched our earlier video on following, which you definitely did unless you're trying to hurt my feelings, then you'll know that Christopher Nolan's approach to filmmaking wouldn't feel out of place amongst the French New Wave filmmakers of the 1950s and 60s, particularly if you remember the central tenets of that movement. Some directors tried to mess with the movie to explore how much you could keep the audience engaged, some would mess with the audience whilst keeping the movie seemingly normal as possible, and some would scrap both and try to engage through discussion of the film itself by way of the context under which it was made and or the socio-political climate of the time. Nolan's projects tend to exist on and off between those first two, but The Prestige seems to be his first attempt at heading towards that third alternative. He's interested in talking to us about how we engage with movies, how we engage with the artificial realities often presented before us. After all, this becomes particularly clear when you consider that The Pledge, Turn and Prestige are built into the film's narrative structure. The difference maker is that Nolan seems to want the audience to be fully aware of what's happening to them as they experience it. If not, then why else would a filmmaker lay out the entirety of the narrative in the opening monologue?
Every magic trick consists of 3 parts, or acts. The first part is called the pledge. The magician shows you something ordinary, a deck of cards, a bird, or a man. The second act is called the turn. The magician takes the ordinary something and makes it do something extraordinary. Now, you're looking for the secret, but you won't find it. Because, of course, you're not really looking. You don't really want to know. You want to be fooled. But you wouldn't clap yet, because making something disappear isn't enough. You have to bring it back. That's why every magic trick has a third act, the hardest part, the part we call The Prestige.
In short, that's the beginning premise of The Prestige, ideas-wise. By participating in viewing this movie, we're being invited into a conversation about our active willing participation in viewing movies. So let's take this idea a step further and talk about the components. With the knowledge that we, the audience, are being spoken to about the magic trick we willingly take part in when we step into a movie theatre, what else can be seen as analogously related to us? Well, if the story is about 2 rival magicians fighting over an audience for their approval, then it's fairly safe to say that said audience is indeed us. But the 2 magicians, whom we've established are metaphors for directors in a sense, are distinctly different in their approaches to their craft, so that must mean that their warfare over the audience is a somewhat ideological one. For starters, Angier is very much a stage performer whom, beyond his talents as a magician, sells himself on his showmanship. The Great Danton, a stage name if ever I heard one, is what he goes by, and his act is precisely what you'd imagine a performer by that name would look like. Lavish set design, fancy costumes, tricks with doves, a fabulously dressed assistant played by Scarlett Johansson, and so on and so forth. Plus the fact that he's played by Hugh Jackman, a very famous Hollywood actor who was in the middle of X-Men 3's production as well as having a background and continuing fondness for musical theatre, makes him the perfect actor with the correct kind of baggage to play this character, to the point where I wouldn't put it past Christopher Nolan himself to have cast Jackman for this reason deliberately. Boredom, by contrast, begins performing in underground clubs and brothels to an audience of unappreciative drunks, plying his craft for pennies until he's able to make it to the big time on the big stage for the big show. He isn't particularly fussed about big production numbers, instead his show is predicated on his phenomenal prowess as a magician, his focus being technical craft and dedication over showiness. His dedication extends so far that he lives a double life with his own stage double, sharing each other's lives on alternate days. The casting here feels deliberate also. I mean, who else would you cast in the role of an intentionally dedicated performer with anyone but Christian Bale, a man who once shouted at the director of photography on set while still in character?
Ah, da-da-da-da, like this in the background. What the fuck is it with you?
I never wanted to have to use that clip of Christian Bale on this show, but at least when I did it was in context. Anyway, so the characters have very different outlooks on what they do as performers, selling two different types of magic shows to us who they are competing over. Now, you may disagree with my interpretation, but I think that Christopher Nolan is trying to present two different approaches to filmmaking here. Consider, Angier is the more moneyed of the two, favouring spectacle over technicality, as most of his tricks require elaborate machinery built by Cutter, and basically was able to inhabit the bigger stage from the moment he went solo. So you could possibly see him as a symbol of Hollywood filmmaking to an extent. By contrast, you could describe Borden as representing independent or underground filmmaking, or at least filmmaking that's more concerned with craftsmanship over spectacle. What becomes interesting is that Angier's struggle to elaborately recreate a deceptively simple trick by Borden to the extent of creating a quantum cloning machine in order to perform it is a thoroughly deconstructionist way of looking at Hollywood's overall approach to storytelling. As a perfect example, Hollywood spends a frankly embarrassing amount of money making their images grander and prettier and more emotional, when it's often found that it's the indie scene with their smaller budgets which have to rely on a tighter focus on craftsmanship which end up making the most powerful stuff. And I'm not saying that Hollywood is incapable of creating emotionally resonant creative works, but the complicated, overcompensatory way that they often find themselves going about creating said work seems utterly baffling when you consider how relatively obvious the solution should be. In other words, The Prestige is a great movie not because the cinematography is really pretty, or because Nathan Crowley built a whole bunch of immaculate-looking sets, or because the production budget was around $40 million. That stuff just icing on the cake. The Prestige is a great movie simply because the script is fucking brilliant. You could set the movie in modern day and cut the budget down by about 2/3 and it would still be a great movie, ignoring all other mitigating factors. But continuing along my train of thought, even though the movie still functions with a split narrative between the two protagonists, the story mostly opts to sit with Angier for a majority of the runtime, as his character arc is the one that's the most interesting. Angier's story deals with him struggling to accept that mistakes can easily be made even by the most highly trained of professionals, as embodied by Borden, who is ultimately responsible for the death of Angier's wife, which strengthens their rivalry and gives Angier and Borden's respective character arcs a lot of dramatic weight. When Angier's stage show goes horribly wrong at the hands of Borden, he exiles himself to America to seek the assistance of Nikola Tesla after being spied by his demonstration in London. He's important to the story because... Oh, hang on. I just realised I don't really feel qualified to talk about Tesla, but I do have a co-writer who might know a bit. Hey, Sam?
Yeah?
You're more of a history nerd than I. Can you explain to the boys and girls at home who Nikola Tesla was or why he's even in this film?
Sure. Nikola Tesla was a Serbian inventor and engineer born in 1856. His contributions to the modern technological world were immense. If you want to see an example, well, plug something in. He's basically the reason we use AC for mains electricity. His AC system outcompeted Edison's DC setup in the late 1880s in what is termed the War of the Currents.
Hang on, I get that Thomas Edison is relevant given that he was a fastidious inventor who's credited with the inventions of the light bulb, the projector and the kinetoscope, all three of which were incredibly important to the creation of cinema in 1885, but why isn't he in this, given that the movie has so much work going into it in terms of comparing the magic of cinema to the magic of magic?
Well, that's partly to do with the public persona of Tesla and his position in popular culture. Tesla was far more of a showman than Edison. He put on public exhibitions to demonstrate his new inventions, wowing the crowds with his latest technological marvels. He made extravagant claims about devices he'd supposedly invented, or was just on the cusp of perfecting. With the obvious exception of the hat replicator, the machinery Tesla is shown creating and operating in the film is based on things he actually built. His lab seems to be based on the workshop he did occupy in Colorado Springs in 1899. He investigated atmospheric electricity there, producing multi-million-volt lightning discharges. His experiments caused light bulbs near the laboratory to glow by themselves. He also made a remote-control boat once. Still, Tesla claimed to have developed even more exotic machines. The most famous is possibly the Teleforce weapon, a death ray he swore he had nearly finished just before his death. He actually worked on two superweapon concepts, one a particle beam, the other a gun propelling metallic droplets through electromagnetism. He proposed the building of energy weapons so powerful that would make war impossible.
What?
I don't know, it made sense to him.
Okay, so he was a character, but how does that explain his prominence in the film?
He's in the film for three reasons, basically. One, his grand public spectacles juxtaposed nicely with the magic shows of both Danton and Borden. An inventor using showmanship to sell science versus magicians using science to sell a show. Two, it allows Nolan to compare the relationship between Borden and Danton with the relationship between Tesla and Edison. Edison is almost a mob boss in this film, sending heavies to get Tesla's best stuff. The prestigious Tesla, like Borden, is poorer, less business savvy than his competitor, but he invents things that the richer man Edison, like Danton, envies because he can't replicate them. 3. Since this story requires an impossible invention to be built, using Victorian science, in the interest of the suspension of disbelief, it's necessary for the writer to include a mad scientist figure of whom the impossible can be allowed.
So it's a steampunk thing?
Yes, basically. Or retropunk, or electropunk, or whatever punk label should be attached to this particular form of stylized technological anachronism. You've all heard of steampunk, I'm sure. You're on the internet after all. It would be like not having heard of shipping or furries. Steampunk as a term was first coined by K.W. Jeter in 1987 to describe his own clockwork-heavy nostalgic science fiction. But steampunk as a contemporary cultural movement basically began with Alan Moore's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen comic series. A series well worth checking out, don't let the film put you off. The comic brought together characters from multiple Victorian literary works as a kind of 19th century Avengers, and had a strong focus on Victorian science fiction. The stories of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells in particular. Good as the comics were, however, their brand of alternative history spawned imitators. And now we have not only steampunk literature, which at least produces the occasional decent work, but steampunk art, and design, and fashion. Over-designed corsetry with cogwheels sticking out at odd angles. Heck, there's even steampunk music.
So in other words, steampunk is what happens when goths discover brown.
That more or less sums it up. The perfect steampunk design is a stovepipe hat which is actually a stovepipe. But to return to my point, Tesla is pretty much the go-to inventor of effectively magical, impossible technology within this genre. He turns up in scores of books, comics and TV series, essentially to play the part of Professor Farnsworth.
That seems appropriate as there was a big reinvested interest in him in the 90s, which led to steampunk becoming a much more prominent genre, roughly around the same time that Christopher Priest would have written the novel. Okay, so Tesla is here to enable Angier's big stage ambitions. What's interesting is that his big ambitions to outperform Borden essentially get him nowhere. Angier's character arc is basically about him learning to cope with the loss of his wife at the hands of Borden, becoming immensely jealous of his family and relative success whilst Angier was left with next to nothing. He reinvents himself as the Great Danton, a name given to him by his deceased wife, and then persists with their now bitter rivalry. What's fascinating from Angier's standpoint is that his obsessive drive to strike back at Borden effectively dooms him to repeat the memory of his dead wife over and over. The third act makes a point of actualising this as part of the final set piece, as Angier, with the help of Tesla's quantum cloning machine, kills himself over and over again, living through what his deceased wife experienced. He's no longer afraid of death, and thus no longer afraid to get his hands dirty, and he accepts this.
But what does his obsession, the mystery of the transporting man, amount to in the end? After he's defied physics, created in effect genuine magic in order to match Borden, not to mention killing himself several times, Borden's secret turns out to be such a simple, small, prosaic thing as being a twin. Not miracles, just craft and discipline. The mystery, it turns out, was greater than the solution, while Angier's pursuit of the solution had only succeeded in bringing pain and ruin to them both. In the original book, Borden writes in his journal, magicians protect their secrets, not because the secrets are large and important, but because they are so small and trivial. The wonderful effects created on stage are often the result of a secret so absurd that the magician would be embarrassed to admit that that was how it was done. He goes on, the fact that the trick is spoiled if his secret is revealed is widely understood. Most people enjoy the sense of mystery created by the performance, and do not want to ruin it, no matter how curious they feel. Or as Kane says in Neil Gaiman's Sandman, it's the mystery that endures, not the explanation. A good mystery can last forever. The mysterious corpse has a magic all its own. No one really cares who done it. Unearthing the workings of a conjurer's trick, or the workings of a film, can be a bit like studying a unicorn. It's so magical and enthralling, and you want so hard to understand it, so you dig and you dig. But soon you realise that you can't put the pieces back together again, and all the kids are crying. But at least with a magic trick, there is a single definite answer to be found at the centre of it, even if that answer is sometimes as disappointing and depressing as a mass of glittery entrails. With a film, this is not always so.
This is the eternal problem we come up against when it comes to analysis or even simple criticism. One can find endless things to say about creative work, but there's always a psychological need to want to find the right interpretation, or indeed any interpretation. A great example of this phenomenon is the recent documentary Room 237, which features several different perspectives on Stanley Kubrick's brilliant and surreal The Shining from 1980. In the film, all participants analyse the same movie, watch the exact same frames that Stanley Kubrick cut together in the form of a running time of 149 minutes, or 119 minutes if you're from Europe, all heard the exact same eerie music and took in the exact same atmosphere, tension and dread, and when presenting their arguments about what The Shining is really about, they all come to their own wildly different conclusions. Partly this is because Stanley Kubrick made an ingeniously crafted surrealist work, the kind of thing that Grant Morrison would describe as a chaos that we have to make sense of, but mostly it's because of the very nature of interpretation. One person claims The Shining is about the genocide of Native Americans, another claims it's about the Holocaust, another claims it's about Stanley Kubrick admitting that he faked the moon landings. Really? And another says it's about reworking the old story of the Minotaur in a maze from Greek mythology by mistaking this poster in the background of a skier for a Minotaur. But my personal stance on the matter is to say that all interpretations are both correct and false at the same time. especially the moon landing shit, obviously. You see, there are two schools of thought when it comes to the interpretation of a creative work. There are some who say that the author's intent is the only interpretation that matters, and others who say that once the work is out there in the world to be scrutinised, every interpretation is equally valid. The question ultimately is that if the artist tells you that their work isn't about what you think it's about, does that invalidate your opinion? In the case of The Prestige, Christopher Nolan is doing precisely the opposite. He actively wants you to know everything is fair game because it's ultimately kind of futile. My interpretation is that the point of the ending is to imply that even though you can search and stare deeply into a creative work, the ending will never be found due to human perception. We're all looking for that magical moment where something just is what it is, where it just works, and to deconstruct it is futile because there's still that part of us that wants the thing itself to maintain that sense of magic, essentially meaning that it's somewhat psychologically necessary to believe in the impossible. You can't take a creative work apart fully because once you realise how everything works, by its very nature it stops working, so there's a kind of psychological resistance to analysis that keeps the magic alive to an extent. Which troubles me deeply because it basically implies that me and Sam have built this entire show on an utter fallacy. So on that utterly depressing note, I call it case closed. I'm Matt Crowley.
I'm Sam Lightwing.
And that was The Prestige.
Join us next time when we talk about one of the greatest movies of all time, apparently.